Some nurses mistake compliance for competence. That is what Dr. Caldwell said 43 minutes before Katie Morrison saved his patient's life with a procedure he didn't know existed. St. Michael's in Portland smells like antiseptic and floor wax under fluorescent lights that hum in B-flat. The pediatric intensive care unit stretches across the third floor in a horseshoe pattern, 12 beds separated by curtains that don't quite block sound or the weight of parental terror that hangs in the air like humidity before a storm. Katie Morrison moves through it with hands that never shake, a gait favoring her left leg slightly, a compensation from shrapnel that the hospital records don't mention and that no one here has ever asked about. She checks vitals on 7-year-old Marcus Chen, Navy Captain Richard Chen's son, reading the machines with the precision of someone who has read them in worse conditions, field hospitals in Helmand Province, a forward operating base in Marja where the dust never settled and the casualties never stopped coming. Marcus's oxygen saturation sits at 98%. His heart rate is steady. His temperature normal. On paper, he is stable. But Katie sees what the charts don't capture, the boy's intelligent dark eyes tracking her face as she adjusts his foot drip, searching her expression for information the specialists have already told his father is unreachable. Profoundly deaf. Neurologically declined. Permanently nonverbal. 12 doctors across 2 states have signed off on it. 12 doctors who looked at a child and saw a diagnosis instead of a person. Katie has documented Marcus's medications 3 times this week. The discrepancies are small. Calculated. The dosage timing doesn't match his chart by exactly 14 minutes on Tuesday, 22 minutes on Wednesday, and 37 minutes yesterday. The insulin injections are labeled as subcutaneous when they're being delivered intravenous. The sedative concentrations are half strength on nights when the evening nurse works and full strength on nights when it's someone else. She's written it all down. 3 separate incident reports in the system, each one a small red flag, each one documented in her methodical handwriting that leaves no room for misinterpretation. The boy's lips shape soundlessly as she checks his pupils. Not deaf to all stimulus. Not nonverbal in the way 12 specialists concluded. Just unheard. Katie recognizes the look because she's seen it in mirrors for 18 years, the expression of someone trying to communicate in a world that has already decided you have nothing to say. "Hi, buddy," she says, keeping her voice low and steady. No baby talk. No exaggerated lip movements like his also intellectually disabled. She signs 3 letters carefully, M-A-Y. She watches his eyes widen. She watches his shoulders straighten incrementally. She's been signing to him for 6 minutes each shift when no one is watching. AGAIN. She does it again. His hand moves, trembling slightly against the bed rail, and his small fingers attempt to mirror her shape. Not perfect. Getting closer each day. No one sees this. Not the residents on rounds. Not Dr. Caldwell during his twice-daily visits. Not the rotating staff nurses who treat Marcus's room like a medical puzzle instead of a place where a 7-year-old boy is being slowly erased. The boots are in her locker on the ground floor, wedged beneath her spare scrubs and the civilian identification that says Katie Morrison, RN, BSN. Worn combat boots, still dusty from Marja, the leather creased in all the places that come from 3 tours and 1,247 days deployed. The Marja dust is embedded in the treads because she has never cleaned them. The dust is evidence. Evidence that the woman who wears compression socks to work and keeps her head down during rounds is also a Master Chief Petty Officer in Naval Special Warfare, assigned to St. Michael's under what the Pentagon calls a protective positioning operation. Captain Richard Chen, Marcus's father, is naval intelligence. His work has made him a target. The assignment was straightforward: blend into the hospital system, monitor the family, maintain cover, report through channels. Watch for threats. Identify compromises. She has identified a compromise. It's named Caldwell. Katie returns to the nurses' station as Grand Rounds begins, a ritual that happens twice daily at St. Michael's where the attending physicians walk the unit like generals inspecting troops. Dr. Caldwell leads the group, 12 residents trailing behind him, notepads ready, eager to absorb whatever he says because he has the authority to sign their paychecks and determine their fellowship placements. He's dressed in crisp white, his watch gold and expensive, his voice carrying the particular confidence of a man who has never been questioned and never expects to be. They stop at Marcus's room. Caldwell pulls back the curtain with theatrical precision. This patient presents with profound sensorineural hearing loss, he begins, and Katie watches from her station, her hands continuing to organize medication cards with mechanical accuracy. Nonverbal. Limited neural response. The family's expectation management has been challenging. They cling to outdated notions about rehabilitation. He glances toward the station where Katie stands. His eyes find her with the precision of a predator locating prey. We have some staff members who seem to believe that compassion substitutes for medical knowledge, he continues, his tone conversational, his volume elevated just enough that the nearest residents glance over. Outdated triage protocols. Unnecessary documentation. Perhaps an overestimation of personal capability. One of the residents smirks. A second one lowers her gaze to her notebook, embarrassed on Katie's behalf. The third one, a woman with sharp eyes and a future ahead of her, meets Katie's stare directly. The competent ones always see what Caldwell is doing. The competent ones are the ones who leave St. Michael's. Katie's jaw tightens imperceptibly. Her hands don't pause. She slots another medication card into its slot with the kind of precision she used to clean and reassemble and 416 Hong Kong dollars in complete darkness. The hand position is identical. The focus is identical. The absence of tremor is identical. What Caldwell doesn't know is that his carefully constructed conversation is creating evidence. His public humiliation of a junior nurse in front of 12 future physicians. His attempt to isolate her from the system. His veiled threat about her competence. All of it is pattern behavior, predatory reconnaissance. He's testing to see if she'll break, cry, defend herself, retreat. All of it would be useful to him. Tears mean emotional weakness, defense means paranoia, retreat means she'll avoid his unit, which means she'll stop documenting his inconsistencies in Marcus's chart. He has no idea that she's already uploaded copies of those incident reports to a secure server using the hospital's Wi-Fi at 2:22 a.m. when the network traffic is lowest. He has no idea that her methodical documentation style isn't a personality quirk, it's operational training. A cryptologic technician first class specializes in intelligence gathering. A Master Chief Petty Officer knows how to build cases that hold up in court. The Grand Rounds group continues, moving to the next bed. Caldwell's voice fades as they pass. The residents disperse. The unit settles back into its rhythm of beeping monitors and the soft wheeze of ventilators and the sound of 4 pumps delivering medication in precise milliliter increments. Katie retrieves her lunch from the staff room, a measured meal that costs $6 and contains exactly 480 calories, and 2 residents are near the vending machine when she walks in. One is the smirking resident from Rounds. The other she doesn't recognize. That nurse thinks she's smarter than 12 doctors, the first one says, not looking at her directly but saying it loud enough that she's meant to hear. The ones who evaluated the deaf kid. The second resident doesn't respond. The silence stretches. Katie opens her lunch container, keeping her movements economical, her breathing controlled. Her heart rate stays steady. This is the test. This is Caldwell working through proxies, watching to see how she responds to mockery. She closes the lid of her lunchbox. She turns and walks past both residents without acknowledging them. She's 15 feet away when the first resident mutters something about overstepping and thinking she's military, and Katie doesn't break stride. But then Caldwell appears behind her, materializes from the corridor like he was waiting for this moment, because he probably was. He's holding coffee in a white paper cup, steam rising from the lid, and his eyes are cold in the way that comes from someone who has learned that kindness isn't strategic. Security escorts, he says conversationally, as if they've been discussing this. Standard procedure for staff members who overstep boundaries. He takes a sip of coffee. His eyes don't leave her face. Inappropriate documentation. Access to files outside their scope. The hospital has protocols about behavior like that. Katie's jaw doesn't clench. Her breath doesn't hitch. She simply closes her lunchbox and returns to Marcus's room, moving with the same economical gait she's maintained all shift, each step placing her weight on the stronger leg, the left leg, the one that doesn't have shrapnel from an IED near the femoral artery that almost cost her the limb entirely. Marcus's intelligent eyes follow her face when she enters. His small hand reaches toward her from the hospital bed. Katie sits beside him, not checking vitals, not charting, just present. She signs 3 letters again, M-A-Y. She watches his fingers move, trying to mirror her shape. Getting closer. And then she sees something that all 12 specialists missed entirely. She sees Marcus's left hand moving separately, compensating for the hearing loss, using his whole body to communicate because his voice was never the problem, the world simply wasn't listening. The laughter came from near the vending machines at 11:48 a.m., right where Katie retrieved her lunch from the staff room refrigerator. 2 residents she didn't recognize stood with their backs to her, shoulders shaking. "That's the nurse who thinks she's smarter than 12 doctors," one said, his voice pitched to Carrie. "Caldwell says she keeps questioning his equipment orders. Like she's running the place." The other resident snorted. "And get this, she's been spending time with the Chen kid. The deaf one. You know, the one the whole specialist panel said was unreachable." Katie closed her lunchbox without opening it. Her hands remained steady. Her breathing stayed level. The kind of calm that comes from having already survived worse. She turned and walked past them, their laughter following her like smoke. Neither resident looked at her face as she passed. They didn't need to. They'd already made their judgment. She was just a nurse. Just someone who'd questioned the billing codes on a level 1 rapid infuser that St. Michael's had ordered 7 of, when the hospital used maybe 2 per month. That afternoon at the nurse's station, Dr. Caldwell appeared behind her with the precision of someone who'd timed his approach. Katie was charting on Marcus's post-meal vitals, his blood pressure stable, his oxygen saturation holding at 97%, when she felt him there. She didn't turn. She kept writing. "Nurse Morrison." His voice had that particular quality, the one he saved for grand rounds. Loud enough for the floor to hear. "I wanted to remind you that security escorts are standard procedure for staff members who overstep their professional boundaries." He sipped his coffee. The cup was monogrammed. Sterling silver. Probably cost more than Katie's entire locker of possessions. "Wouldn't want any confusion about your role here." His eyes were the color of old ice. They held no anger, which was worse than anger. Anger could be reasoned with. This was the look of someone who'd already decided her outcome. Katie's knuckles whitened on her pen for exactly half a second. Then she set it down with deliberate care, aligned it parallel to the edge of Marcus's chart, and nodded once. "Understood, Doctor." Her voice was level as a surgical laser. 2 words fewer than necessary. 2 fewer than would seem desperate or defensive. She stood, closed the chart, and turned away from him without waiting for a response. It wasn't a request. It was a dismissal. The residents watched. The techs pretended not to. One of the nurses, Sandra, who'd been kind about the equipment billing questions, looked away. Katie walked to Marcus's room without hurrying, without the brittle steps of someone fleeing. She moved like someone who had somewhere to be and nothing to prove. Marcus was sitting on his hospital bed, his legs dangling, still wearing the blue scrubs they kept for pediatric patients too large for the printed gowns. The moment Katie closed the door behind her, his entire body shifted. His eyes, which had seemed so empty to the specialist panel, tracked her with laser precision. He straightened his spine. His hands came alive. Intelligence lived in his fingertips. Intelligence lived in the way he studied her face for recognition of what he was trying to communicate. 12 doctors had looked at this child and seen deficiency. Katie looked at him and saw a person who'd been trying to speak the entire time, waiting for someone to actually listen. She pulled the vinyl chair closer to his bed and Saturday. Not above him. Level with him. Eye to eye. Hi, Marcus. She signed as she spoke, the hand movements fluid and practiced. She'd been doing this in the margins, the stolen minutes between charting and rounds. Afternoons after her shift when she sat in her car in the hospital parking lot, learning ASL from videos on her phone, her combat boots propped on the dashboard, dust from Marja still embedded in the treads. Marcus's entire face changed. His mouth opened. He began signing frantically, his hands moving in a pattern Katie had started teaching him 3 weeks ago. The signs were imperfect, his fine motor control still developing, but they were unmistakably intentional. Deliberate. Cognizant. Good, Katie signed back, her hand moving in the shape of her fingers coming together at the chin, then opening outward. Tell me more. He signed the word for help. The exact gesture Katie had introduced to him on their second session, showing him how his hand could move against his own body to communicate what his voice could not. His eyes were wet now, the first time Katie had ever seen the Chen boy show emotional response. It wasn't crying. It was relief. It was recognition. It was the moment a child realized that someone had finally decoded the language he'd been speaking all along. I see you, Katie signed, her movements deliberately slow so he could follow. I know you're in there, Marcus. I've always known. The boy leaned forward and Katie caught him, his small body rigid with tension at first, then melting against her shoulder. Over the next 3 weeks, working in shifts at St. Michael's, Katie expanded Marcus's vocabulary systematically. The word for pain. The word for tired. The word for hospital. The word for doctor. She taught him colors using the equipment around the room, the white of the sheets, the blue of her scrubs, the red of the emergency call button. She taught him family. She taught him sad and happy and scared and safe. During night shifts when the floor quieted to the hum of ventilators and monitor beeps, Katie would sit beside his bed and watch him sign back to her, his hands becoming steadier, his confidence building with each successful exchange. He was a child, she realized, who'd been suffocating in silence while the world decided he was empty. The medical establishment had looked at his deafness combined with whatever neurological condition they couldn't quite diagnose and saw a write-off. 12 specialists had convened, reviewed his chart, and walked away with the conclusion that Marcus Chen was unreachable. Katie had reached him in 3 weeks with nothing but hand gestures and patience. She taught him the sign for friend. Marcus learned it immediately and pointed at her with a movement so emphatic it made her chest ache. He tried to form her name with his small hands, approximating Katie through finger positions that weren't quite accurate but were perfectly, beautifully intentional. This child who'd been labeled nonverbal had spent his entire conscious life trying to communicate with a world that refused to learn his language. On her break one evening, sitting alone in the staff room while the fluorescent lights buzzed their persistent drone, Katie allowed herself 3 minutes. She sat at the table where residents had laughed at her. She pressed her palm against her sternum, feeling the steady rhythm of her heart, the one that had learned to stay calm under fire, under pressure, under impossible circumstances. The combat boots waited in her locker like ghosts. Master Chief Petty Officer Katie Morrison was somewhere underneath the scrubs and the deferent posture and the carefully controlled voice. But that wasn't the worst part. Not yet. The monitor's rhythm strip flatlined at 2:44 a.m. Katie heard it before she saw it, that single electronic note that meant everything had stopped. Marcus Chen lay motionless in bed 7, his small 7-year-old body rigid, his lips the color of bruised plums. Oxygen saturation, 34%. Blood pressure, undetectable. Heart rate, gone. She moved without thinking. Muscle memory took over. The code cart arrived in 30 seconds. 2 residents, a respiratory therapist, the night attending, all converging on the small boy like iron filings to a magnet. Katie was already at the bedside, her hands on his narrow chest, starting compressions with the mechanical precision of someone who had performed this dance in desert tents and forward operating bases, under fire, with shrapnel still embedded in the surrounding soil. Continue chest compressions, the attending ordered. His voice carried the cadence of someone reading from a protocol, not someone who had ever felt a child's ribs fracture under their palms. 1 minute. 2 minutes. The attending worked through the standard resuscitation algorithm like a man reading instructions from a manual. Epinephrine pushed. Ambu bag squeezed rhythmically. Defibrillation pads applied. Nothing worked. The monitor stayed flat. A child's heart, somewhere inside that small chest, had simply decided to stop. 3 minutes. 4 minutes. Resuming compressions, the attending said, his tone already shifting toward the language of futility. Around them, the night shift nurses moved with the choreography of defeat, documenting times, adjusting drips, their expression settling into the particular exhaustion that came from knowing exactly how this would end. Katie did not stop pressing. She felt the geometry of his ribs under her palms, calculated the depth, adjusted her angle. Her hands knew what they were doing because her hands had learned this skill in a place where children died from things that had nothing to do with medicine, bullets, explosives, things no child should ever touch. She had lost 2 pediatric patients in Marja. She would not lose this one. Time, the attending asked. 4 minutes 40 seconds, a resident answered. The attending opened his mouth. Katie could see it forming, the question about whether they should call it. Whether they should stop. Whether the small boy in front of them had already left the room. Step back, Katie said. The attending turned to her slowly, as if surfacing from deep water. His expression shifted from confusion to something harder. Excuse me. I need a scalpel. Not a request. Not softly. The words came out like a command, and for a moment, just a moment, everyone in the room heard something different in her voice. Something that had nothing to do with nursing protocols or hospital hierarchy. 14-gauge angiocath. Chest tray. Suction immediately. This is inappropriate. His O2 saturation is 34% and dropping. She kept her hands moving, kept the compression steady. Tension pneumothorax. The left lung collapsed 3 minutes ago. He needs needle decompression at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, or we lose him in the next 90 seconds. The respiratory therapist moved before the attending could order her to stop. Equipment appeared on the bedside table. A scalpel. Suction tubing. Gloves snapped like gunshots in the sudden silence, a sound Katie had heard in operating tents, in trauma bays, in places where people either lived or died based on how fast your hands could move. She stopped compressions. Cleaned the skin with chlorhexidine in 2 swipes. She had done this before. Not in a hospital under fluorescent lights, but in a compound in Helmand province with a 12-year-old girl whose brother had triggered an IED. The girl had lived. Katie had walked her out herself, carried her through darkness, handed her to a medic with instructions in diary and a certainty in her voice that this child would survive. This child would too. The scalpel went through skin and muscle and cartilage in one clean motion. The residents watched with the frozen expressions of people witnessing something they did not have permission to see. Katie inserted the angiocath smoothly, felt the subtle pop as it entered the pleural space, and the hiss of air escaping, the sound of pressure equalizing, of physics and biology reaching agreement about whether a small boy got to keep living. The monitor changed. A single beat appeared on the screen. Then another. Then a rhythm began to establish itself, chaotic at first, then stronger, then unmistakably coherent. Sinus rhythm. 86 beats per minute. A heart, restarted from the dead, beating inside a child's chest because someone had refused to accept the hospital's favorite word, impossible. Get an EKG, Katie said, stepping back. Her hands were steady. Her voice had dropped back into something that approximated deference, though the residents would later tell the day's shift that something fundamental had shifted in the room at 2:24 a.m. Contact cardiology. This child needs imaging within the next 45 minutes. His left lung was compromised. Possible thoracic effusion. Possible pericardial involvement. The attending stared at her. How did you? I'm going on break, Katie said. She stripped off the gloves and walked toward the door, leaving the attending with his mouth open and the monitor beeping steadily behind her. "Let me know when his father arrives." She was sitting in the break room with cold coffee in a styrofoam cup when Dr. Caldwell entered at 5:03 a.m. He did not look at her. He was already on his phone, already making calls with the particular tone of someone activating a network he had spent years cultivating. Katie heard fragments: patient safety issue, liability exposure, behavioral red flags, unhinged. By 5:51 a.m., he had called 3 board members. By 6:15 a.m., he had placed a call to the Navy Medical Personnel Office in Washington. Katie did not hear the conversation, but she did see his face when he hung up, a man who had just realized that his carefully constructed set of dominoes was about to fall in a direction he had not anticipated. By 9:13 a.m., hospital administration had launched a formal investigation into her credentials. And that's when the real nightmare began. Security arrived at 2:04 p.m. 2 officers, neutral expressions, the particular professionalism of people who had been told not to make eye contact. Katie's access badge was deactivated in front of the day shift. The card made a soft plastic sound as it hit the table, a small death, quietly executed. Dr. Caldwell was in Captain Chen's office by 2:36 p.m., explaining to the father of a 7-year-old deaf boy that the hospital could not tolerate reckless behavior, no matter the outcome. Katie watched from a distance as the captain sat with his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles had turned white. The Navy bearing was still there, the spine, the jaw, but something inside him had broken like the thoracic cavity of his son had broken, collapsing under pressure he could not control. "Your son is alive because of luck, not skill," Caldwell was saying, his voice carrying the particular tone of a man who had spent hours preparing this lie. "We've placed him with more appropriate nursing staff. The hospital is committed to his full recovery, but we cannot allow our standards to be compromised by unorthodox behavior, regardless of intent." Captain Chen nodded slowly, the movement of a man accepting defeat. Katie's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly as she watched through the glass partition. The mission parameters were clear: maintain cover. Monitor the target. Report through channels. Never blow operational security. Never let the asset know he was being watched. But Marcus had signed help to her 2 nights ago. Marcus, the child that 12 specialists had declared permanently nonverbal, had spelled out a single word in hand shapes that meant he understood something was wrong. That someone was hurting him. That he needed rescue. And Katie now understood exactly how he was being hurt. The medications Marcus should have been receiving were not reaching him. Someone was substituting them. Someone was slowly poisoning a deaf 7-year-old child to send a message to his father, a Navy captain whose intelligence work had made him a target, made his child a target, made everything about this child a weapon in a war Katie was not supposed to acknowledge. Blowing her cover meant failing the operation. It meant losing access to Marcus. It meant walking out of St. Michael's and watching another operative, someone less prepared, less lethal, less willing to keep a child alive when the protocol said to let him die, take over monitoring. It meant accepting that the game had rules, and she had just violated the most important one. She picked up her bag at 2:17 p.m. as the day's shift arrived. No one said goodbye. The bag contained nothing but her wallet and the pair of worn combat boots she kept in her locker, marja dust still embedded in the treads, the leather scarred from things she would never name. She walked past Marcus's room without looking in. The new nurse was already there, introducing herself to Captain Chen, her voice cheerful and professional and utterly unprepared for what was actually happening in that room. The rain started before Katie reached the parking lot. It fell like applause, heavy and relentless and utterly indifferent to the fact that she had just been forced to choose between saving a life and completing her assignment. Both were impossible. Both would fail. The combat boots left wet prints across the concrete as she walked toward her car. Behind her, St. Michael's rose into the Portland sky like a monument to exactly how wrong 12 doctors could be. Dr. Caldwell's phone call came at 5 in the morning, his voice sharp as surgical steel cutting through the hospital administrator's sleep. "We have a patient safety issue requiring immediate action," he said, each word clipped and precise. The night nurse, Katie Morrison, performed an open-chest resuscitation without authorization. Thoracotomy. Direct cardiac massage. On a 7-year-old. He paused, letting the weight settle. She has no surgical credentials. No trauma certification. She acted on pure instinct, and yes, the child survived, but we have a liability nightmare on our hands. The administrator's voice crackled back through the speaker, groggy but sharpening. We'll need to review the incident. Caldwell already had the next move prepared. Before sunrise, he'd activated his network, calls to 3 board members at their homes, his voice carrying the practiced concern of a doctor protecting his institution. The question isn't whether she saved the child, he told them, one after another. The question is whether this hospital wants to be known as the place where nurses decide to perform emergency surgery. By 7 o'clock, hospital administration had launched a formal investigation into Katie Morrison's credentials. Her background check, her certifications, her employment history, all of it now flagged for review. What they didn't know was how deep that review would go, or what doors it might open. Caldwell's final move came just before noon. He sat in his office with the door closed, a second cup of coffee cooling on his desk untouched, and made a call to the Navy's Human Resources Division. Not a casual inquiry. A pointed one. I need to verify the employment status of someone I believe may be working under false credentials in my hospital, he said, his voice carrying just the right amount of concern. Katie Morrison. She's listed as nursing staff, but I have significant doubts about her background. The Navy operator had transferred him twice before he reached someone who could help, or someone who could at least listen. He asked his questions carefully. Is Katie Morrison currently assigned to Portland? Is she active duty? Has she undergone recent credential verification? Each question was designed to probe for inconsistencies, to find the gaps where a cover identity might fracture. What he didn't know was that those questions had already triggered automated flags in naval intelligence systems, alerts that would reach Katie's handler within the hour. The escort came at 2 o'clock that afternoon. 2 security guards in polo shirts, their radios crackling softly at their belts, found Katie restocking supplies in the pediatric ward. We need you to come with us, one of them said, not unkind, but final. She didn't resist. She'd been trained for this scenario, extraction, exposure, the moment when a cover collapsed. Her access badge was deactivated before she even reached the security office, a key card that would no longer open any door in St. Michael's. The head of security himself sat across from her, a folder open on his desk containing her personnel file, her hire paperwork, her vaccination records. We're placing you on immediate administrative leave, he said, sliding a form across the desk. Pending the results of the credentialing investigation. Katie signed it without reading the terms. Through the window behind him, she could see the parking lot, the afternoon rain beginning to fall, and somewhere in this building, Marcus Chen was alone with doctors who couldn't see him, nurses who didn't know him, and a night shift coming in that she wouldn't be part of. Dr. Caldwell appeared in Captain Chen's viewing room at 2:15, his face arranged in careful concern. Marcus was sleeping, his small chest rising and falling with the rhythm of the hospital, monitors beeping their steady reassurance around him. I wanted to speak with you directly, Caldwell said, lowering his voice to that tone physicians used when delivering delicate information. There was an incident last night. One of our nursing staff performed a procedure she wasn't qualified to perform. The child survived, thank God, but we cannot allow this kind of recklessness to continue at St. Michael's. Captain Chen's jaw tightened. She saved my son's life. Caldwell nodded slowly, as if acknowledging a difficult truth. She did. But what if the next time she doesn't? What if her instinct fails? We can't have cowboys in a hospital. He let the silence sit. She's been terminated effective immediately. We're taking all appropriate measures to ensure it never happens again. The captain said nothing. He was looking at his son's sleeping face, at the monitors, at the place where that nurse had stood 12 hours earlier with her hands inside his son's chest, her movements precise as someone who'd done this before, many times before. The kitchen was empty when Katie came home, save for the sound of Danny's cartoons playing softly from the living room television. She set her things on the counter and sat at the kitchen table with the discharge papers spread in front of her like a map of failure. Severance documentation. Termination for cause. Investigation pending. Her hands were steady as she read through them, her breathing controlled, but her eyes betrayed her, tears running in silent streams down her face as she stared at the paperwork that ended her position at St. Michael's and, more critically, ended her access to Marcus. Her handler had already called twice. Protocol demanded she stand down, allow the replacement operative to take position, maintain operational security. But that wasn't who Katie Morrison was, not really. The nurse was the cover. The Master Chief Petty Officer was the truth underneath, and every instinct screaming through her body was the instinct of someone trained to protect her asset, to defend the people under her watch. The small footsteps came just after 6 o'clock. Danny, 7 years old with his father's dark eyes and his mother's stubborn chin, appeared in the kitchen doorway in his superhero pajamas and saw her there. He didn't say anything at first. He just looked at her face, at the way her shoulders curved forward, at the tears she was too tired to hide anymore. He walked over to her without speaking and climbed into her lap, the way he'd learned to do when his mother had bad dreams, when the nightmares from her time before Portland still found her in the dark hours. "Why are you home early, Mommy?" His voice was small and careful, the way children learn to speak when they sensed an adult's breaking point. "Are you sad? Did something bad happen at work?" Katie wrapped her arms around him, pressing her face into his hair, breathing in the smell of his shampoo and the absolute innocence of a child who didn't understand that sometimes the people who needed saving the most were the ones already broken. "Yeah, baby," she whispered. Something bad happened. She held him there, her hands steady as training made them, but her heart splintering with every breath, because what she couldn't tell him was that the 7-year-old boy in a Portland hospital had needed her, and she had walked out anyway, following orders, maintaining cover, failing her operation in the way that mattered most. The fluorescent light above the kitchen table hummed its steady mechanical song, indifferent to her tears. By 10 o'clock that night, Katie had made her decision. The mission parameters had been clear: maintain cover, monitor the target, report through channels. But Marcus Chen wasn't a parameter anymore. He was a child she'd taught to sign, a child whose intelligence had been dismissed by 12 doctors, a child whose own father hadn't understood until Katie showed him what his son could become. And somewhere in St. Michael's, there was a night shift beginning, and if her instincts were right, and they always were, someone was preparing to hurt him. Her phone buzzed at midnight. A text from her handler, replacement operative positioned. "Stand down." She read it twice, then she put the phone in her pocket and pulled the worn combat boots from her bedroom closet. The Marja dust was still embedded in the treads, still there after all these years, a residue of the last time she'd had to choose between following orders and saving a life. But that wasn't the choice this time. This time, there was only one choice that a Master Chief Petty Officer could make. She kissed Danny's forehead as he slept, left a note on the counter, and drove through the Portland rain toward the hospital, knowing exactly what she was about to do, knowing exactly what it would cost her. The loading dock entrance code was old, from her first week at St. Michael's, a maintenance pass she'd memorized and never used. It still worked at 11:15 when she entered through the darkened back hallway, her civilian clothes soaked from the rain, her boots leaving small puddles on the tile floor. The night ward was quiet. Monitors beeped their rhythmic pulse. Someone's call light flickered unanswered at the far end of the corridor. She moved without hesitation toward Marcus's room, her muscles remembering patterns from Marja and Kandahar, from a dozen black operations where moving quietly through hostile territory had meant the difference between extraction and body bags. The door to his room was slightly ajar. Through the opening, she could see a nurse, someone Katie didn't recognize, someone new, someone who moved with a precision that didn't match the usual patterns of St. Michael's night staff. The nurse was pulling a vial from her pocket. Not from the medication dispensary. Not from the crash cart. From her pocket. She was drawing solution into a syringe, preparing to push it into Marcus's for line. Katie's vision narrowed to a single point of absolute clarity. She raised her phone and captured 3 photographs before she moved. Then she stepped into the room with the bearing of someone who'd cleared hostile buildings 1,000 times, and the nurse's hands froze, the syringe suspended halfway to the foreport. "Step away from the child," Katie said. Her voice had changed, dropped an octave, lost all the deferential softness the hospital staff had ever heard from her. It wasn't a request. Now. The nurse's face went white. She was young, maybe mid-20s, with a kind of hollow fear in her eyes that came from understanding she'd been caught doing something that couldn't be explained away. She backed away from the forestand, dropping the syringe, and Katie caught it before it hit the floor. The vial was still in her pocket. She left it there, evidence. She disconnected the poison 4 bag and replaced it with fresh saline from the crash cart, her movements precise and sure, muscle memory taking over. The night nurse retreated without a word, her footsteps quick down the hallway, her radio going silent. Katie waited for security alerts that never came. She waited for alarms that didn't sound. Instead, she heard only the monitors and the rain against the window and the sound of a 7-year-old boy beginning to wake. Marcus's eyes opened. He saw her standing there, and his hands moved immediately, the sign she'd taught him. Help. Bad. Medicine. His small fingers formed the shapes with absolute precision, intelligence burning through his dark eyes, that same intelligence 12 doctors had said was unreachable, that same intelligence that had made him a target because he was the son of someone powerful enough to be worth killing. Katie signed back, "I know. You're safe." She was wrong about one thing. She wasn't safe, not anymore. But he was. She pulled out her phone and photographed the vial, the empty syringe, the disconnected 4 bag. She texted her handler with location and timestamp, primary asset compromised. Operative position. Asset will survive tonight. Then she held Marcus's hand, small and warm and alive, and sat in the dark hospital room while the rain fell and Portland slept and the life she'd built, the cover she'd maintained, the mission she'd followed for 3 months began to disintegrate. Security footage would show everything. She was blown. Her cover was gone. But Marcus would wake up tomorrow, and he would be alive, and that was the only measure of success that mattered to a Master Chief Petty Officer. At 4 in the morning, her replacement operative arrived, a man she'd never met, carrying orders she'd already violated, with instructions to maintain watch. She briefed him on the medication substitution, on the poison 4, on the fact that someone outside this hospital wanted Captain Chen's son dead enough to place a substitute nurse in the pediatric ward. Then she left, because staying would only compromise his position. She passed Dr. Caldwell in the parking garage just as he was arriving for early rounds, coffee in one hand, his briefcase in the other. He saw her face in the fluorescent light and went absolutely still. His eyes went from confusion to recognition to something like terror. "You're trespassing," he said, reaching for his phone. Katie kept walking, her limp more pronounced from exhaustion and from the shrapnel that still lived in her left leg from Marja. "I'm calling the police," Caldwell shouted after her, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. She didn't turn around. She just kept walking toward the rain and the parking lot and the unknown that came after a cover fell. But that wasn't the worst part, not really. The worst part came the next morning, when Katie Morrison, the nurse, the cover identity, the woman who'd existed for 3 months in the margins of a hospital, ceased to exist entirely. The hospital lobby television flickered at 6:27 a.m. Breaking news. A photograph filled the screen, a woman in dress uniform, ribbon stacked across her chest, hair military short, eyes the color of storm clouds over open water. The caption crawled beneath, Master Chief Petty Officer Katie Morrison, missing from classified Naval Medical Intelligence operation since yesterday, May 14. Navy officials request immediate information. The veteran security guard, a former Marine named Holloway with a 30-year career and hands that still trembled slightly from IED shrapnel, stood frozen in front of the screen. He'd seen that face exactly once, 3 days ago, walking through the loading dock in scrubs at dawn, moving like someone who'd already survived the worst the world could offer. His jaw tightened. His eyes closed for exactly 2 seconds. Captain Richard Chen had arrived for morning visiting hours, Marcus's stuffed whale tucked under one arm, and he stopped dead in the lobby when Holloway's voice cut through the ambient hospital noise like a command tone. "That's Nightingale," Holloway said quietly. Then, in a voice that carried through the atrium, echoing off the terrazzo floors, "Master Chief Petty Officer." Heads turned. A resident pushing a med cart slowed. Two nurses at the front desk exchanged glances. The television continued its coverage. Authorities say Morrison's disappearance may be connected to ongoing intelligence operations in the Pacific Theater. Her last known location was Portland, Oregon. Captain Chen's hand went white-knuckled around the whale. He looked at the screen. At the uniform. At the name running across the ticker. At Holloway, who was standing at attention now, chest out, the kind of posture that comes from 3 decades of military protocol. "Where?" Chen said, and it wasn't a question. "A rear admiral arrived within 60 minutes. Not called. Appeared." The kind of immediate response that happens when a decorated operator's cover explodes and the operational security implications become a Pentagon-level crisis. He was tall, carried himself like a man who'd commanded submarines and lost sleep over classified decisions, and his presence made the air pressure change in ways that didn't require explanation. He asked to use the hospital administrator's office. Dr. Caldwell was already suspended, placed on administrative leave pending the investigation launched by naval auditors, investigators who'd spent 6 hours with his billing records and found enough financial discrepancies to constitute a second career in fraud. But Caldwell's secretary brought coffee anyway, out of habit or fear or the shattered muscle memory of institutional respect. The Admiral read Katie's record aloud. Captain Chen sat across from him, Marcus balanced on his knee, the boy's hand resting on his father's chest, feeling the heartbeat accelerate as each decoration was named. 3 tours, Helmand Province, the Admiral said, reading from a classified file that should never have existed outside a vault. Attached to Joint Special Operations Command Task Force, 2010 through 2013. Bronze Star for Battlefield Medicine, Camp Lezun, April 2011. He paused. The weight of that pause was substantial. Silver Star for Direct Action Medical Support, Sanjin Valley, July 2012. Second Silver Star, Marja Extraction Operation, November 2013, 47 lives saved under sustained fire. He looked up. Another pause. Navy Cross. Highest combat medical decoration. She pulled 3 wounded Marines out of a compound surrounded by Taliban fighters and kept them alive on a 13-hour halo ride to Kandahar airfield. All 3 survived. Marcus was signing something. Captain Chen's hands moved automatically in response, the muscle memory of a parent learning his child's language, learning to speak in movements instead of words. The boy was asking questions that Chen couldn't fully answer yet. The Admiral set the file down. His hands were steady but his eyes carried the weight of knowledge he couldn't share. Master Chief Morrison was placed in St. Michael's Hospital as part of Operation Sentinel, a classified counterintelligence protocol targeting foreign operatives attempting to exploit your position through your son. We had reason to believe hostile actors were monitoring your family. Captain Chen's arm tightened around Marcus protectively. Master Chief Morrison discovered that threat on her own initiative. After her termination from hospital duty, she continued unauthorized visits to this facility. She discovered that a substitute night shift nurse, hired through a temp agency, cleared by nobody, background checked by nobody, was introducing a medication into your sons for that mimicked neurodegenerative disease. Slow degradation. Symptoms that would have killed him in approximately 47 days without appearing to be anything other than his underlying condition progressing. The silence was the kind that happens when someone articulates a threat so specific that the absence of it feels like gravity suddenly stopping. She disconnected that for. She photographed the medication. She documented the substitution with timestamps. And in doing so, she compromised her operational cover beyond recovery. The Admiral's voice had a quality like distant artillery. She did that because a child needed help more than the operation needed secrecy. Marcus was still signing. Still asking. His father's hands were shaking now, moving in response but without precision, the language breaking down into pure emotion. Captain Chen looked at the Admiral. "Where is she?" "Being debriefed. And reinstated. Full honors, full clearance, full back pay." The Admiral paused. "If you request her as your son's primary care coordinator, the Navy will approve it. We owe her that much." The investigation that followed moved with the precision of institutional machinery finally pointed in the right direction. Naval auditors, working in parallel with hospital administration and the Oregon Medical Board, dismantled Dr. Caldwell's operation in the time it takes a normal workday to complete. 2 years of billing records. 17 surgical procedures that never needed to happen. Medical equipment orders that didn't match patient outcomes. A supplier in Southern California sending kickback checks to a P.O. box registered to Caldwell's wife's maiden name. The numbers were devastating. $340,000 in fraudulent billing. 42 patients charged for unnecessary surgeries. 12 separate instances of procedure codes that were falsified on Medicare forms. Each one documented. Each one time-stamped. Each one logged in patient charts by a nurse who'd understood that precision was its own form of resistance. Katie's methodical documentation, the thing Caldwell had mocked during grand rounds, the outdated triage protocols he'd used to humiliate her, had created a perfect audit trail. Every questioned equipment order appeared in her notes. Every procedure she'd flagged appeared in her charting. 3 months of working in the margins while he'd worked in the spotlight, and she'd built an architecture of evidence without knowing she was doing it. Dr. Caldwell was placed on immediate suspension pending criminal investigation. The Oregon Medical Board launched its own inquiry within 24 hours. By the following Thursday, the local news had its headline, "Prominent Portland surgeon accused of Medicare fraud, defrauding patients of hundreds of thousands of dollars." His photograph appeared alongside Katie's. The contrast was absolute. One woman in military dress uniform. One man in a perp walk, hands in cuffs, his white coat stripped away, his institutional authority reduced to nothing in the time it takes a news cycle to turn. Katie watched from her apartment that night, Danny asleep against her shoulder, his breathing synced with the rhythm of the television. She was watching not because she took pleasure in the destruction, she'd seen too much of that in Marja, in Sanjin, in a dozen other places where victory looked like loss when you examined it too closely, but because she needed confirmation that Marcus was safe. That her cover blow meant something. That the operation had failed but the outcome had succeeded. Captain Chen visited her apartment the following Saturday. He brought Marcus, who moved immediately toward Danny like metal toward magnetism, the two boys communicating in signs they'd invented together in hospital hallways during the 3 months Katie had been his nurse. Chen stood in the kitchen, uncertain how to begin. "Marcus wants to see you," he said finally. "Every day. He asks me to teach him new signs so he can tell you about school, about his thoughts, about things that don't exist yet in his language." Katie's hand steadied the counter. She didn't speak. "The Navy reinstated you to active duty with full honors. Your back pay, your rank restored, your record cleared." Chen paused. "And I requested you as Marcus's primary care coordinator. Medical, educational, developmental support. The Navy approved it." Katie looked at Danny, who was showing Marcus a drawing of a helicopter. Her son was 9 years old and he'd watched his mother cry at a kitchen table 3 days ago and hadn't understood why the world was allowing that to happen. "I'm not cleared for civilian placement," she said quietly. "You are now. I requested it personally. Captain to captain." Chen's voice had authority in it, the command tone that didn't require explanation. "Nightingale, this is your home. This is where you belong." Katie thought of the combat boots in her closet. The Marja dust. The 3 Marines who'd lived because she'd refused to stop moving. The 12 specialists who'd looked at Marcus and seen nothing but a problem to be managed rather than a child to be reached. "I'll accept," she said. The Oregon Medical Board revoked Dr. Caldwell's medical license permanently 6 months later. The criminal trial followed 9 months after that, 14 counts of healthcare fraud, each one documented in charts Katie had written, each one presented to a jury by prosecutors who didn't need to explain why precision mattered. He was convicted on all counts. 18 months in federal prison. Financial penalties that bankrupted him. His house went on the market at foreclosure. His cars were repossessed. His name appeared on every healthcare fraud database in the country, searchable forever. And then there came a moment, 18 months after Marcus's life was saved by a nurse in scrubs and a woman who carried Navy Cross Valor in her muscle memory, when Captain Richard Chen walked past a community college classroom in outer Portland. He wasn't looking in. He was walking toward the parking lot where Katie waited, where Danny was putting on his shoes, where the ordinary geometry of a family assembled by choice rather than blood was preparing to drive across the city for an elementary school presentation. Through the window of that community college classroom, visible for exactly 3 seconds as Chen walked past, Dr. Caldwell sat at a desk with a CPR dummy in front of him, teaching fundamentals to community college students for $18 an hour. His name tag said Professor. His voice was inaudible beyond the glass. His institutional authority was a memory that nobody was interested in preserving. Captain Chen didn't slow down. Didn't look in. Just kept walking. The elementary school gymnasium was full of second graders and their families gathered for a heritage project presentation. Marcus Chen stood at the front, his hands moving with the fluency of someone who'd been given permission to communicate his whole self, telling his classmates about his father's Navy service and the woman who saved his life by refusing to believe 12 doctors who said he couldn't learn. Katie stood in the back of the gymnasium. Danny beside her, now Marcus's best friend and sign language practice partner. Her left leg ached where shrapnel had lodged during the Marja extraction, a reminder that some things stay with you forever. The combat boots, the ones with Marja dust embedded in the treads, were retired to a shadow box on her wall at home, next to her Navy Cross and a photograph of her holding Marcus the day he'd signed his first complete sentence, "Thank you for not giving up." Captain Chen's hand rested on her shoulder as Marcus finished his presentation to applause that echoed off the gymnasium ceiling like gunfire in reverse. A parent asked Marcus's teacher, "Is that his mother?" The teacher glanced at Katie, at the wedding ring she now wore, at Chen's proud smile. "That's his family," she said simply. After the presentation, Katie and Marcus practiced new signs in the hallway while Danny translated for curious classmates. A news crew was filming a segment on Marcus's remarkable progress, the deaf child written off by 12 specialists who was now thriving in mainstream education. They asked Katie for a comment about his achievements. She looked at Marcus, alive and laughing and whole. She thought of the Grand Round's humiliation. The security escort. The moment Danny found her crying. The moment she'd chosen a child's life over operational security. "True class is what you do when the lights go out," she said simply, then returned to teaching Marcus the sign for perseverance, moving her hands with the patience of someone who'd learned that strength and gentleness weren't opposites. If you've made it this far, you understand what happens when someone refuses to accept what the world tells them is impossible. Subscribe for more stories about the people who change everything by simply refusing to give up. And tell us in the comments, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value?